Hello hockey fans, and welcome back to another video. The state of the world during the 70s and 80s was arguably as tense as it's ever been. Thanks to the ongoing Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, every country on the planet was anxiously watching these two nations with bated breath, hoping that tempers didn't boil over and the nuclear missiles would be left in their silos. Not only did these two opponents want to be the better nation economically, socially, and politically, but they also wanted to be the best at hockey too. The rise of the Soviet Union's Red Army team and their dominance on the medal tables decade after decade made it difficult for the NHL to claim that they housed the best hockey players in the world. This narrative certainly wasn't helped when NHL franchises faced off against the Soviets, as the Red Army team used their pass-first, team-oriented playing style to put on a clinic and embarrass some of the greatest teams the league has ever seen. Though the Soviets would often wipe the floor with their opponents, one team from Pennsylvania was able to flip the script and give their own beatdown, both metaphorically and literally. This is the story of the Philadelphia Flyers Red Army game, when the Flyers beat the Soviets. Before we begin, I just want to mention that over 80% of you who have watched my videos this month have not subscribed to my channel, so if you do enjoy this video and you want to see more like it in the future, consider hitting that subscribe button. It would really help me out a lot, folks. But anyways, on with the video. In order to tell this historic tale, allow me to take you back to January 11th, 1976, at the Spectrum Arena in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. The hometown Philadelphia Flyers were getting set to face off against the Soviet Union's premier hockey team, CSKA Moscow, as part of the Soviet Super Series tour against some of the NHL's oldest and most successful teams. With a 7-3 win against the New York Rangers, a 3-3 tie against the Montreal Canadiens, and a 5-2 victory against the Boston Bruins, the Red Army team had done a great job of upsetting 3 Original Six franchises who had all made the NHL playoffs the year prior. Couple that with their 19 Soviet League championships between 1947 and 1975, their 6 straight European Cups between 1969 and 1974, and their roster making up much of the Soviet Union national team, who had won 14 World Championship golds and 4 Olympic golds at the time, and the Red Army team had certainly showcased why they should be considered the best hockey team in the world. Though the Soviets' tour of North America was just a group of exhibition games on paper, for the players taking part it was anything but. Due to the brewing tensions between the Soviet Union and North America, and with each side wanting to prove that they were better than the other, dropped gloves and bench-clearing brawls became a pretty common occurrence when these two nations faced off. Whether it was the top professional players squaring off, or their junior teams filled with teenagers, the dislike and distrust that the two countries had for each other would always boil over, and the game would see a number of punches thrown before the final buzzer sounded. So for both sides of the conflict, this Super Series was more than just exhibition games. They were gold medal, Game 7 of the Stanley Cup Finals kinda games. Despite facing little resistance from the other NHL teams, the Soviets' final game of the Super Series would certainly be their toughest, as they would be facing off against the back-to-back defending Stanley Cup champions, the Philadelphia Flyers. Though Philly's roster featured plenty of talented hockey players, such as captain Bobby Clarke, forwards Bill Barber and Reggie Leach, and goaltender Bernie Perron, they weren't exactly known for their slick passes or fancy stick handling. During this period in Flyers history, the team was more commonly known as the Broadstreet Bullies, a nickname given to them due to their aggressive, physical, fight-heavy play in which they would be more than happy to beat their opponents into submission than score a highlight reel goal. As the Soviets made their way to the city of brotherly love, they were all too aware of their opponent's current reputation and didn't like it one bit. Russian newspaper Pravda created a cartoon in which the Flyers team were drawn in the form of Neanderthals wielding clubs instead of hockey sticks, whilst the players on the team still remembered Bobby Clarke's infamous slash to Moscow star Valery Kharlamov's ankle during Game 6 of the 1972 Summit Series, a slash that fractured Kharlamov's ankle and limited the forward's overall effectiveness for the rest of the tournament. Like most Americans at the time, Flyers owner Ed Snyder had developed a general distaste for the Soviets, which only increased thanks to some contentious negotiations with Soviet officials when organising the Super Series game. Though his patience was tested on numerous occasions, and he would consider ceasing negotiations at many points, Snyder would bite his tongue and get the deal done. He knew that this game against the Soviets wasn't just an opportunity for his team to beat the Russians. It was a chance to show both the Soviets and the entire hockey world that the Philadelphia Flyers were more than just a group of goons, that they were the most physical, the most talented, and the most unrelenting hockey team on the planet. As the pre-game festivities got underway, there was little love lost between the hosts and their Eastern European guests. Not a single player or staff member on either team attempted to engage in conversation or even look at a member of the opposite team, whilst Flyers announcer and Russian speaker Gene Hart had supposedly taught Snyder a phrase in Russian that he could say before the game wishing both teams the best of luck, but once he got to the podium, Snyder decided against saying it. Luckily for both teams, they would have plenty of time to use this anger and frustration on their opponents in the next few hours. As the puck was dropped and play got underway, it was the Flyers who would be red hot out of the gate, thwarting the Soviets' up-tempo transition playing style by getting in their faces and throwing the body. Though the game remained scoreless roughly 10 minutes in, it wasn't for lack of trying, as the Flyers had registered 12 of the first 13 shots on goal, but Moscow netminder and Russian hockey legend Vladislav Trechak was able to stop every single one. With the Flyers continuing to dictate the flow of play and hit every Soviet player that stepped onto the ice, tempers were bound to reach a boiling point sooner rather than later. What happened when these tempers did boil over, though, was certainly unique. Approximately halfway through the first period, Flyers defenseman Ed Van Impe, who had just served a 2-minute hooking minor, left the penalty box and immediately threw his elbow into the head of Soviet star Valery Kharlamov, the same player who had his ankle broken by Clark just a few years earlier. Kharlamov then fell to the ice writhing in pain for a good few minutes, whilst the Soviets looked for a penalty to be called by referee Lloyd Gilmore. When Gilmore judged that the hit was clean and no penalty would be handed out, Moscow head coach Konstantin Loktev was furious to say the least. To express his frustration with the decision and to protest the non-call, in a completely unprecedented move, Loktev then ordered his players to leave the ice and head back into the locker room right in the middle of the first period. This act prompted Flyers commentator Bob Cole to utter the now famous line, "They're going home," again and again, a phrase that has become synonymous with the game in the years that have followed. Once the Soviets had returned to their locker room, it was rumoured that Ed Snyder rushed in to argue with the Soviet Hockey Federation president Vyacheslav Koloskov and tell him that his team wouldn't get paid their $200,000 fee for the entire Super Series if they didn't play the full 60-minute game. However, NHL president Clarence Campbell, who was in attendance at the game, completely denied these claims, stating that Snyder never directly spoke to Koloskov or told him about the money, though Snyder did admit to telling Campbell to mention the money to him, and it was actually Campbell and NHLPA president Alan Eagleson that entered the Soviet locker room first to speak to the team's officials. After things had calmed down a bit, and both Campbell and Eagleson had talked to Koloskov and Loktev, the Soviets were willing to return to the ice and continue the game, provided the delay of game penalty that they had received for leaving the bench would be wiped off the board. When the officials refused to remove the penalty, since this was probably the most obvious delaying of a game that they had ever seen, the Soviets once again became upset and refused to leave the locker room. However, 17 minutes after leaving the ice, cooler heads finally prevailed. The Soviets accepted the circumstances, returned to the ice, and got ready to play the rest of the game. Unfortunately for Moscow, this attempt to get their own way or slow down the Flyers' momentum really didn't work. In fact, it made things even worse for them. Philly forward Reggie Leach would score the opening goal of the game just 17 seconds after play resumed, and Rick McLeish added the insurance marker roughly 5 minutes later to give the Flyers a 2-0 lead late in the first. Though Soviet forward Viktor Kuturgin would score early in the second, as he put the puck past Flyers netminder Wayne Stevenson, who was playing in place of starting netminder Bernie Perron since he was recovering from neck surgery, The Flyers would take their lead on the scoreboard and never look back, as defenseman Joe Watson would score Philly's third goal of the game just 2.5 minutes into the second period, before Larry Goodenough scored the final goal of the game at 4:01 into the third, to give the Philadelphia Flyers a 4-1 victory over CSKA Moscow when the final buzzer sounded. Not only did the Flyers win the game, but they dominated the opposition, as the Flyers ended up outshooting the Soviets 49-13. The biggest reason for this was due to the strategy put in place by Flyers head coach Fred Shero, who had done some homework and looked at the Soviet strategy before the game. Instead of telling his players to back off at the blue line, which allowed the Soviets to outnumber their opponents as they entered the offensive zone, or chase the Russians and give them too much space inside, Shero told his players to stand up to the Soviets at the blue line to stop them entering the zone so easily, and refused to chase the Soviets so the puck was kept on the perimeter, something the Soviets hadn't faced from the other NHL teams during the entire Super Series. By beating the Red Army team, the Flyers had not just defeated arguably the greatest team the world had ever seen, they had also made history, as they became the first NHL franchise to ever defeat CSKA Moscow. This feat was so difficult to achieve that they would be the only team to hold this prestigious record for another 4 years after the event, when the Montreal Canadiens defeated the Red Army team by a score of 4-2 in 1980. To emphasise just how difficult of a task this was, in the 36 games that the Red Army team played against NHL teams between 1975 and 1991, they lost just 8 of them, posting a record of 26-8-2 in the process. So yeah, the Flyers did pretty good. Following this controversial yet highly entertaining bout, the two sides would understandably have conflicting opinions on what happened during the game. Flyers head coach Fred Shero jokingly claimed that the Soviet hockey program had been put back at least 25 years since Vladislav Tretiak had allowed a short-handed goal, whilst Tretiak himself claims that the 3-3 tie against the Montreal Canadiens was the highlight of the Super Series, accusing the Flyers of playing rude hockey that night. Moscow head coach Konstantin Loktev accused the Flyers roster of being a bunch of animals, whilst the Flyers confirmed their suspicions that the Soviet players were highly skilled, but far too soft. One thing's for sure though, the Soviets wanted to test themselves against the Flyers, and oh boy did they get tested alright. In the years following this historic game, the two combatants would go on to have vastly different journeys. The Philadelphia Flyers would be unable to pull off the Stanley Cup three-peat as they were swept in the 1976 finals by the Montreal Canadiens. They would go on to make 5 more Stanley Cup Finals appearances in the decades that have followed, but they have been unable to go all the way and get their hands on the cup since 1975. On the flip side, CSKA Moscow would go on to win the Soviet League Championship for 13 consecutive seasons between 1977 and 1989, before the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Since then, CSKA has gone on to play in both the Russian Super League and the KHL, where they have appeared in 3 KHL playoff finals during the league's 11-year lifespan, and won their first and only Gagarin Cup championship in 2019. Though no player or fan could quite have predicted just how crazy this game would be, when the Philadelphia Flyers defeated the Red Army team in January of 1976, they not only recovered some of the NHL's lost dignity and helped the Americans one-up the Russians, they earned a pretty prestigious place in the hockey history books too. It may not have been the best hockey game to have ever been played, but an international powerhouse going up against the back-to-back Stanley Cup champions sounds like a pretty great matchup if you ask me. Throw in some unique off-ice antics, and this Clash of the Titans has certainly become a game to remember. Not a bad performance for a bunch of goons, eh folks? And that's the story of the Philadelphia Flyers Red Army game. What do you guys think about this Super Series showdown? Let me know in the comments below, I would love to hear what you guys think. But thank you very much for watching guys, I hope you have enjoyed. Please feel free to like, subscribe, share, or watch some of my other videos. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye! A big thank you to Antti Hannanen, Chris Gadsby, Connor B, Jordan Whitehead, Paul Mallia, Roman from London, The Legacy and Worthless Pieces, as well as a huge thank you to Max Artis for helping support this video via Patreon. If you too want to help support the channel a little bit further and get a shout out at the end of every future video, make sure you head over to patreon.com/oddmanrush and become a patron today.